To week 12 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few tight ends I'd look to get on the wire this week. The first guy, Adam Trotman of the New Orleans Saints. I've mentioned him over the last few weeks at a waiver wire ad. And right now he's starting to produce and put up numbers here, is Trotman. In week 11 at Philly, he had a great ball game. 5 catches, 58 yards, and a nice touchdown grab in the back of the end zone that he snagged. So the last few games here for Trotman, week 9 versus Atlanta, 4 catches, 47 yards. Week 10 at Tennessee, 5 catches, 32 yards. And like I mentioned here at Philly in week 11, 5 for 58 and a touchdown. So right here, him and Trevor Siemian have a pretty good rapport. Him and Winston really weren't on the same page, but right now, Siemian, he's spreading the ball out, and he's looked pretty decent in terms of getting his receivers involved and putting up fantasy numbers. So right here, Trotman's definitely benefiting here from Siemian at quarterback. And right now, if you need tight end help, this guy's definitely worth a shot, in my opinion. And he's out there in 93% of fantasy leagues with another pretty decent matchup in week 12 as well versus the Buffalo Bills. The next tight end I've looked to get this week's Tyler Conklin of the Minnesota Vikings. So right here, tight end, a pretty weak position once again on the wire this week. But Tyler Conklin still available in 63% of fantasy leagues after he's had a good string of games up until week 11. So the last few games here for Conklin, week 9 at Baltimore, 5 for 45. Week 10 at the Los Angeles Chargers, 3 catches, 11 yards, 2 TDs. And week 11 versus Green Bay, 3 catches, 35 yards. So right here in week 12, he's at the San Francisco 49ers. And the Niners, they're pretty good versus tight ends this season, giving up the 8th least amount of fantasy points. But right here, Conklin, we know he can make plays. We know he's capable of having big games. And this week 11 game, it was the big one for Justin Jefferson. So right here, it just seems like between these tight ends and receivers in Minnesota, you don't know which guy's going to go off. And that's why, in my opinion, you should own most of these guys because they could go off at any time, obviously. And I think Conklin could have a decent ball game in week 12 to get on the wire this week. Joshua the Rugera of the Green Bay Packers. So right here, we know Robert Tonyan's out for the season. And they need tight end help and another guy in that offense that can make plays. And the Rugera here in week 11 in Minnesota, 2 catches, 37 yards, and a nice touchdown catch. So over the last few weeks, he's seen more playing time, but had the biggest game of the season here in week 11 was the Rugera. So week 9 at Kansas City, 2 catches, 16 yards. Week 10 versus the Seattle Seahawks, 2 catches, 9 yards. And then like I mentioned, week 11 here in Minnesota, 2 for 37 and a touchdown. So right here, week 12, a good matchup here for the Rugera versus the Los Angeles Rams that give up the 9th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. And right here, I know stretch here because he had one good game, but he's available in 100% of fantasy leagues, and he plays with a great quarterback in Aaron Rodgers, who might start targeting him more and start having more trust in the Rugera. So right now, if you're in deeper leagues or have no tight ends that you could count on, he's worth a shot this week. The next tight end's Anthony Furska of the Tennessee Titans. The first guy, I thought he was going to break out this season here, but we really haven't seen anything from him this year. But in this ball game, he had a good one, was Furska in week 11. 5 catches, 26 yards, including a fumble recovery touchdown. So right here was a pass out of the backfield to Hilliard. He got hit, fumbled it, and Furska jumped on it, and it counts as 6 points in fantasy football. So right here, obviously, it was a fluky touchdown, but he did have 7 targets in this game. He out-targeted Jeff Swain, the other tight end on this roster. And Furska, he's done nothing like I mentioned this season, but right now in deeper leagues, he's available in 95% of fantasy leagues. And I know in week 12 it's a tough matchup at the New England Patriots, who give up the second least amount of fantasy points to tight ends on the season. But right here, he's definitely a guy to keep an eye on after a good ball game and one of the top scorers at the tight end position in week 11. And the 5th and final tight end I look to get on the wire this week's Ryan Griffin of the New York Jets. I spoke about Griffin last week as a waiver wire ad. In a PPR leagues, I know he didn't have the greatest of games, but he had 3 catches for 39 yards. So over the last few weeks, he's been okay, is Griffin. Week 9 at the Colts, 4 catches, 28 yards and a touch. Week 10 versus Buffalo, a catch for 21 yards. And then week 11, like I mentioned, 3 catches, 39 yards. So right here, he's got a great matchup week 12 at the Houston Texans that give up the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. And Griffin, he's a big target for this Jet team. This offense has looked pretty okay with Joe Flacco and even Mike White at times here. before Flacco replaced him as a starter over the last week. But right here, once Zach Wilson comes back, all bets are off with this Jet offense because they haven't been in sync or look good at all with Zach Wilson this season. But anyway, Ryan Griffin's available in 99% of fantasy leagues, and he's the tight end to look to get on the wire. So that's a few tight ends I'd look to get on the waiver wire heading into week 12 of the fantasy football season.